So good morning from Alaska. Welcome and thank you for joining the Global Arctic Youth Network for this seminar. The Arctic Youth Network is open to all who are interested in shaping the future of the Arctic. This current seminar is part of a series of presentations that are geared towards discussing key issues facing the Arctic and communities around the world as we prepare for the upcoming Arctic Youth Summit, which will be held this October in Rovaniemi, Finland. My name is Hillary Krieger. I am going to be the moderator. I have only been in Alaska for 2 years, but during that time I have gotten to see how people not just live, but thrive in the Arctic. However, I have had a chance to listen to many of these people, and they have said that small things that people in the world are doing are causing big issues for them. And if we were all just to change those small things, we could put the Arctic in Alaska on a better course. So that's ultimately why I'm here. I'm hoping that we can push us at least in a slightly better direction. Today we are going to be listening to a woman from Sweden. Her name is Stina. She's going to be discussing the Arctic from the viewpoint of a Swedish person and Earth law. So take it over, Stina.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Well, it's evening here in Norway, where I am currently. I thought I'd start off with just saying a few words about myself. I'm a law student. I'm from Stockholm, the capital of Sweden, and study in the typical student city of Uppsala. And I'm kind of finished. I only have my master thesis left, and then I'm done. But my master's in international law and international environmental law. Currently, I'm living in Norway, in Tromsø, which is just above the polar circle, so in the Arctic community. I'm also involved in the international group of the Swedish youth organization Push Sweden, and we basically track international climate events, and most closely the UNFCCC negotiations. But foremost, I'm also Ocean Rights Associate at the US-based NGO Earth Law Center. And we work to promote the Earth Law approach, and I focus on oceans to get them better protection. And I'm gonna get back to this soon, because this is the main topic for my talk with you today. But first, I thought I'd say something about Sweden. We have the Sami people up north, which is the indigenous people in Sweden. And they, like other Arctic indigenous people population, is very much affected by the impact of global warming and climate change. And at the moment, approximately 70,000 Sami still live in and around Arctic Europe, and there's about 20,000 in Sweden. And reindeer herding represents a significant aspect of the Sami identity, and it's often perceived as a way of living, as the Sami particularly emphasize harmony with the natural environment. And that concept, harmony with the nature and the environment, is a concept which also can be seen in Earth law, and I'm going to get back to that, but that's a connection. So if you want to involve the indigenous people more and more, Earth law and rights of nature is a way of doing that, as it kind of represents their ideology as well. However, the traditional way of living for the Sami with reindeer herding is under pressure, as the rising temperatures threaten the size of the herds, and it causes financial problems, because less chilly winters means less snow and more rain, and that freezes into ice, which makes it harder for the reindeer to reach the plants that they need to eat. They can, when it's snow, they can get through to the plants, but they can't get through ice. So therefore some reindeer starve, and the females often give birth to stunted young. So yeah, it causes a lot of economical damage to families. So climate change is definitely a huge threat to these families that are depending on reindeer herding. So the question of indigenous governance is, of course, like significant to the Arctic, and the recognition of native rights is an issue that goes well beyond the Swedish national borders. Powerful indigenous governance structures could definitely provide basis for native communities to deal with changes in a more feasible way. And the Swedish legislation is not at all in line with the international standards on indigenous people's rights. For example, the Swedish example of indigenous self-determination does not at all reflect the essence of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples' Rights, as the situation is highly dominated by the Swedish state. So what's needed is basically greater local involvement, the sharing of responsibility for natural resources, co-management projects, or at least collaboration on equal footing. And Earth law and rights of nature, as I will talk about soon, is a possible concrete solution for not only nature, but also indigenous people like some. And the Arctic, as you know, is a part of a complex system of political and social and economical dynamics, which links actors inside and outside the region. And of course, as we know, the Arctic is of tremendous significance, both looking at the untapped resources, but also the geopolitical standing. And of course, whilst there are emerging economic opportunities, there's significant concerns regarding the levels of change which the region can and will undergo. And this international law will play an increasingly relevant role in the Arctic due to the composition of the region. We have 8 states with territorial borderlines on land and sea, as well as sea areas beyond national jurisdiction. And unlike the Antarctica, the Arctic has no single international governance regime. I guess basically because the one polar region is a continent covered in ice, it's uninhabited and surrounded by ocean, whereas the other is an ocean surrounded by land and ice masses, making up the territories of sovereign states. So today, Arctic governance is kind of recognized as a complex system of fragmented international and regional regulations, complemented by non-binding soft law mechanisms. And the problem with this is that also that the Arctic today is by most humans seen as just another piece of land, which can be owned by one or many countries together. So it becomes a question about sovereignty and ownership. And I believe, as a rights of nature activist and working for that this needs to change. We need a paradigm shift if we're to create a safe future environment. And this brings me on to Earth law and rights of nature. So as I said, many legal systems around the world have nature. The definition of nature is something that's property of humans. And when we have that thinking, that means that environmental laws actually legalize environmental harm by regulating how much pollution or destruction of nature can occur within the law in order to protect.
Stina, we can't hear you anymore. Where'd you go? All right. It appears as though Stina is having some technical difficulties. Please, let's give her a few minutes. We'll see if she can get back on. A lot of the times, Dina, what people need to do. There we go. Okay.
Oh, sorry?
We couldn't hear you for the last 10-ish seconds. So if you wouldn't mind backing up a little bit and then keeping on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, I was just saying that despite like we have had decades of environmental legislation, but the Earth health continues to decline. And under the present system, internationally, the environment has no voice in decision making, and it cannot bring issues to court. And the current environmental laws protect nature only for the benefit of people and corporations, which means that economic outcomes typically overshadow environmental consequences. And even when environmental issues are brought to court, people have to prove that the damage infringes on their own rights, since the environment has no rights. So it never becomes about the actual environment. It's always about the humans or the corporate rights, like kind of masking the actual crucial question. So what will happen then, like with Earth law, is that it will enable people to defend nature in the course for the sake of nature itself. And Earth law and giving nature rights, that aims to protect the environment for all creatures. It ensures true environmental protection via proactive action and effective restoration projects. So in doing so, it brings this paradigm shift I was talking about to holism and an alternative form of management that experts and governments and organizations worldwide agree are needed. And also to mention in this context is that this is not something that just a few people are talking about. This is actually happening all around the world. We have in 2008, Bolivia started to integrate rights of nature in their constitution, and then we have Ecuador doing the same a few years later. And quite recently, New Zealand gave legal rights to the river Whanganui and a national park, and also the mountain Taranaki. But even in India, etc., it's really going on. And in several states in the US is also kind of promoting this approach in how to manage nature and how to live in harmony with nature. So it's not a mere concept like in the hypothetical scenario, it's actually happening. So going back a few years, you can see that this also is not a new thing. It's been talk about this for quite some time. In 1982, the United Nations adopted the World Charter for Nature, and it was 111 votes for it, 1 vote against, and 18 abstentions. And this charter adopts principles of conservation guiding human conduct to be reflected in the laws of each state. It acknowledges that mankind is a part of nature, and that living in harmony with nature gives man the best opportunities. Here again, we have that living in harmony mentioning here as well. It notes that every life form warrants respect regardless of its worth to man. That's also the Earth law thinking. Nature has an intrinsic value. It's not because its resources might be of economic value to us that it's important. It's important because without it, no one can live. The charter also declares that nature shall be respected and its essential processes shall not be impaired. And it calls upon a moral conduct to guide human action in a way that accords other organisms with respect. And a primary function of the agreement is to recognize that man's needs can only be met by ensuring the proper functioning of natural systems. And what Earth Law does, so the Earth Law approach, is that these principles that's mentioned in this World Charter for Nature should and must be adhered to in our decision-making process. More recently, the United Nations again launched the Harmony with Nature initiative. The UN General Assembly passed 9 resolutions since 2009, and in them they called for and defined a new non-anthropocentric relationship with nature, which Earth Law uses the word ecocentrism instead of anthropocentric values. Nature itself, again, should be the center of everything, not humankind. And the 9th resolution calls for a holistic and integrated approach to sustainable development that will guide humanity to live in harmony with nature and lead to efforts to restore the health and integrity of Earth ecosystems. So what would it mean? So let's like play with the thought that we would actually designate the Arctic, or perhaps parts thereof in the beginning, as a legal entity subject to basic rights. What would happen? So I have some thoughts about that, and that would first and foremost legally require parties to protect and restore and maintain the health of the Arctic. It would codify the rights afforded to the Arctic nature and its flora and fauna, including the right to thrive, the right to be free of pollution, and the right to continue its vital cycles. So there we have the rights mentioned in rights of nature. So humans have human rights, like the human rights to life, etc. And nature similarly would have the right to, like I said, continue its vital cycles and so on. A river, for example, would have the right to flow freely without human disturbance, etc. We could also, with Earth Law, add legal guardians to the Arctic areas, the areas that then are granted legal rights. And here we can look at the New Zealand law, which actually have guardians for nature. And these legal guardians, they have a responsibility to protect and act on behalf of the ecosystem that have been recognized to have legal rights. It's the guardian's duty in the management body to protect the integrity and diversity of the ecosystems, and also to defend the areas from activities that may harm the ecosystem and its inhabitants. And more specifically, the guardians may, for example, use their standing to bring legal action upon parties involved with activities which directly affect the health and the well-being of the area that is granted legal rights. So, for example, guardians for the Arctic could then participate in any legal process affecting the Arctic or the Arctic ecosystem, flora or fauna. They could develop or review any relevant guidelines. They could, for example, monitor the health of the Arctic Ocean, monitor compliance with the actual rights that the Arctic has been given, and of course represent the Arctic and the ecosystem in disputes. Earth Law would also, of course, then require that all activities are decided within the ecosystem capacity to support them. And this, like adopting this systems approach, which it's called, it means that we move beyond maintaining an ecosystem simply to provide services to humans, and moving towards maintaining an ecosystem to provide for the continued functions of its constituency elements in perpetuity. So yeah, and again, like we aim to achieve a true healthy ecosystem, and the definition of healthy should then be, of course, formed by science and defined by the well-being and natural state of the Arctic area rather than by its utility to humans. and the burden of proof on those that wish to undertake like extractive or exploitative activities is placed on those people. Yeah, and and implementing this holistic and rights-based framework is basically an opportunity to save and achieve a sustainable future in the Arctic. It will probably, hopefully, facilitate an integrated and regional and cooperative management approach with common ecosystem-based goals that fit within the ecosystem capacity boundaries. And yeah, that's basically what I had to say about Earth Law. We've not only have these examples from all around the world, Earth Law Center also has created a legal framework for marine protected areas. As I mentioned early in the beginning, I'm working for this NGO, which and I'm focusing on oceans. So our approach there is to kind of target marine protected areas as a start. So you can find that framework at the Earth Law Center's website, which is just earthlawcenter.org. And you can download it and give it a look. That would, I suppose, work very well as well in Arctic areas, especially then if we kind of tweak it to fit more in Arctic surroundings. So I'm happy to take any questions about this. I don't know if you want to ask questions about Earth laws more specifically right now. I thought I'd mention something about the youth perspective as well, but maybe we should kind of, if anyone has any questions before going on to that.
Stina, this is Hillary.
Yeah.
I don't have any questions. I'm more just thinking about how it would be used in the United States right now. We are currently looking at drilling in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, and we definitely could use somebody who was acting on behalf of the refuge as opposed to acting on behalf of humans. So that would be fantastic. Do you know if any nation or if the UN is putting out a, not quite a mandate, but something that is like, hey, if you want to do this, please sign on, and then we can move forward in ensuring that all ecosystems are protected with their own guardian?
I don't think that that's something kind of the UN is doing right now. However, there's a very cool person called David Boyd, who was just appointed. What's his title? I think it's Human Rights and Environment Official or something of the UN, and he is known for taking rights of nature and this Earth Law approach very seriously. So I'm kind of like hoping that he would kind of really bring this to the next level within the UN and maybe create something that, like you talk about, like actually where people actually can come together and form some formal mandate. But there's also kind of several organizations all around the world that actually kind of create lists. And just the other day I saw that there's this major petition in Australia, I think the Australian Earth Law Alliance, trying to get people to sign on to give the Great Barrier Reef legal rights or legal guardians. So there's definitely different kind of things like that going on, but not really. There's not really any talk about from the states yet, unless if you don't think about like Bolivia and Ecuador, kind of, which have had this a few years. But yeah, it's still in the beginning.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So yeah, if anybody else has any questions, please let me know. I have chat open so I can see if anybody wants to type anything. You're also welcome to turn on your microphone and ask. I'll give you guys a few more minutes, but I actually think it's fascinating that places in the world are moving towards giving the environment more rights, as opposed to just ensuring that we can continue using the environment for the good of all people. Just because, quite honestly, we're not the only things living in the world.
Yeah.
At least that's what I think.
Exactly. And it's like interesting because when you bring this up to some people, like, oh no, you can't give nature right, that doesn't work. But then you actually have these countries that actually have done it, and not only the global south, like again Bolivia and Ecuador, but also kind of New Zealand, which have more laws that are more similar to the Western ones, that actually also kind of, in respect of their indigenous people, the Maori, have given certain areas rights. So this is actually a real thing. And I think if you compare it to the human rights approach, there's these two approaches that's kind of competing right now. Either the rights of nature that giving nature its own rights, or having the human rights approach that is kind of having the human right to a healthy environment. And I'm not really saying that the one of those is the right one. I think maybe we can actually combine them. But as I see it, the problem with not giving nature rights and just saying that, oh, the humans have a right to a healthy environment, in saying that, we keep to the anthropocentric lifestyle. And if we just have the human rights, it's much more easy to infringe than actually giving another entity rights. So I think a combination of those two is probably the best thing, the ultimate and future framework.
Fair enough. I can definitely understand where you're coming from. So we've gotten no questions over chat. So I believe we are now welcome to move on to youth. We will have another time frame, I'm assuming, at the end. Actually, never mind. Yes, Peter.
Yeah, so
you just muted yourself, Peter.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So yeah, this is Peter in Iceland. And I kind of have a practical question. If, for example, local or national government want to actually implement the Earth Law principles, is it necessary to start with a constitutional change, like you mentioned that some countries have done? Or are there also some ways that local or national governments can kind of start with something that it's more easily done than, for example, a constitutional change might, at least in Iceland, take 8 years?
Yeah, good question. No, I definitely don't think that you need to change the constitution. I would think that an easier way that would take, of course, in Sweden as well, a long time. I think, as you say, 8 years, because they need to be a shift in the government to change the constitution. But no, I think to begin with, it would be great to change the actual national or kind of regional environmental laws more to an ecocentric way of mentioning nature. So in the national environmental laws, not treat nature as property, but more as a place where we live, not a place where we use. So no, I don't see the necessity to start with that massive shift in changing the constitution. I think that was, I don't know, I'm actually not sure how that happened and like what was a massive change in doing that in Bolivia. But as I see it, that would not be possible to begin with here. That needs to come gradually. So yeah. Did that answer your question? Sorry, it was a bit.
Oh yes, and maybe a little bit of a more detailed question of the same question is that, for example, if the environmental protection law would be changed in a given country, is that the only way to facilitate the Earth Law, or is it something that local governments that do not set laws, can they somehow implement the Earth Law?
I think any decision makers that take decisions could possibly interpret the laws that kind of that guides their decision in a Earth Law way. So I think every law can be interpreted differently. So if you interpret a law from the ecocentric or the Earth Law mindset, that's a way of kind of implementing Earth Law as well. Kind of like strategic litigation. We have all these climate lawsuits all around the world. Perhaps we could do like a climate lawsuit where we sue either a state or a corporation or I don't know, and argue that there's principle in international law that are actually kind of having this Earth Law mindset that is not being followed. So I think there's different ways than just saying that we need to change the law. We could also do it in other ways. Yeah.
So basically, the Earth Law Center would be the go-to place for government officials to, I mean, maybe they think that it's a great idea, but they don't really know how to implement it. So that would be a good resource, I guess.
Yeah, and Earth Law Center is still quite a small NGO. In the US, there's several organizations working with this Earth Law approach. So wouldn't necessarily just be the Earth Law Center, even though I'm sure they would be happy to help. But yeah, for state officials to go to any organization that actually officially is promoting this approach, I think would be a great place to start and to get knowledge about it.
Oh, thank you.
All right, so, any other questions? Okay, I guess, Stina, feel free to move on.
Yeah, I thought I'd just mention something about, I also said that I'm involved in PUSH, which is a Swedish organization for youth. And just as we're creating this Arctic Youth Network, I thought I might mention what PUSH stands for. And what we do is basically, the aims of PUSH is to bring young people and youth organizations together and to create a powerful voice for youth in order to create change and also to engage more young people in sustainability related issues. And I think it's just a great opportunity to create this Arctic network, because of course a lot of youth are worried about the future and how we're going to stop climate change and the poverty and injustice in the world. And what we need, I guess, is really a strong voice that tells our leaders that it's time to face the facts and to take action. And this is what I guess AYN could do, and really like kind of come together and represent young people that wants a stable and well-functioning framework and future in the Arctic. And PUSH as well tries to do that nationally, and it's a platform that offers a wide variety of tools for youth that wants to create change. And In Push, members can share skills, they can communicate through the platform, and we also kind of support collaborations and campaigns and other events with the aim of empowering youth. And again, this is what I hope that the AYN could and should aim for as well. And of course, I'm sure that Push would be happy to work, hopefully, with AYN on that. I'm not an official kind of Push delegate. I'm just an international group, but I think that these two organizations perhaps could inspire each other, hopefully, in the future. Yeah, that's all I had to say for that. Any thoughts?
Yes, so basically this could be like the central point. At least it could be suggested that it would become the central point of environmental protection globally, and specifically in the Arctic Youth Network.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, Stina, if you wouldn't mind sending me a link about that, that would be fantastic. I'll put that in the body of our YouTube video that I'm going to be posting of this chat. Yeah, does anybody have any questions? All right, it doesn't appear anybody has any questions.
No.
Well, we have about... Yes, Peter.
Oh yeah, sorry. So I'm just thinking out loud. But Stina, do you know roughly how many countries have implemented this in at least some way internationally?
There's several countries actually. There's, so just on top of my head, they have Bolivia, Ecuador, New Zealand, India. I'm just thinking, there's more. I promise you, there's more. There's several states in the US as well that kind of promotes this.
Okay, so
yeah.
So at least for me, being in Iceland, thinking about the Nordic countries and Europe, and well, I guess also the US, but our legal system is Scandinavian based. So I'm wondering, has this in Scandinavia or Europe or in the Baltics even been implemented anywhere that you know of?
No, unfortunately not, as far as I know. It's still seen as something that's very, from the Western perspective, global South idea. So it hasn't really become known here in the North. But there's, in Sweden, there's this networks consisting of people that wants to work for rights of nature. There's also a network in the that's kind of coming together, that's been around for about a year, I think, called Swedish Earth Law Lawyers. And that's people in some way involved in the law and legal perspective that kind of are eager to kind of transform our environmental law and governance and actually implement Earth Law. But as far as I know, no, there's not a country that officially recognizes that nature have rights yet. Important word, yet. It's coming, I think, hopefully.
Okay, so it might be a good idea to kind of map how susceptible different countries are to the principles.
Yeah, and what's interesting as well, I think I mentioned it, is that there's of course indigenous people from all around the world, and it has been some studies showing that a lot of indigenous groups actually recognize that nature has rights. This is also something that Sami people in Sweden has actually officially said that, yeah, we stand behind the Declaration on Rights for Mother Earth, which is a declaration that came about in 2008, I think. So this is spread throughout the world and in the northern part as well, through the Sami, through the indigenous group. So in that way, we already have it. And if the countries, for example, like Sweden, really wants to respect and kind of promote indigenous people's rights, Earth law would be a way to actually recognize that they have a connection to nature that we need to learn from.
So that would be a very good way to recognize both the rights of the indigenous peoples and the nature.
Yeah, exactly.
I was actually thinking about how when I first started working for the Fish and Wildlife Service, the government organization that I work for, I was put in a class called Alaska Native Relations, where you learn how to interact with Alaska Natives and the different peoples therein. And this would actually be very useful in pitching that, and it would actually be a really good way to kind of get this into the minds of not so much policymakers, because we do not, I don't run in the same circles as policymakers, but it would be a good way to at least get it into the minds of people who work with the environment. So thank you.
Yeah, it sounds great. I agree.
Yes, and relating to that, and maybe this kind of connects to the first webinar from Iceland regarding our plans of founding a Central Highland National Park, is that not just in the highlands of Iceland, but all around the country, there have been development plans where environmental NGOs have not been able to even go to court because we lack this. And even the Aarhus Agreement, and well, Iceland hasn't entirely ratified the Aarhus Agreement, but this would definitely change so much for everything we're struggling with here regarding environmental protection in Iceland.
Yeah, it would definitely change the rules for legal standing, which has been a major issue in many countries, I guess, also very much in the EU. And as you say, the Aarhus Agreement Convention has been very much up for discussion, and many countries trying to kind of tweak that after their national referrals. But yeah, I still would definitely say that you have these guardians that act on behalf of nature, not on behalf of the humans. So yeah, it would change a lot.
Yeah, it's so just crazy that the only way to be able to protect the environment is being someone who is extracting someone from it, or might at least.
Yeah, or like saying that my property has become damaged because of this and that. It's not because it's like my right to my property. It's not because nature itself suffers. It's because I suffer, because my economic interest kind of is damaged. Or yeah.
Yes, exactly. And like the economic interest has been driving the law for, well, I guess since the beginning. But if we look at the human rights, then at least we've gone a bit further in that regard. But this should be, like you say, the same thing.
Yeah, and when mentioning human rights, one has to also like remember that human rights hasn't always been this obvious thing, and it still isn't in many parts of the world. it's very much debated what is a human right and do all people have human rights. So this is kind of a movement. The Earth Law movement is a movement that has connections to the women's rights movement and the human rights, because like 100 years ago, women didn't have any rights at all. They were property of the men, of their husbands or fathers or brothers. And then when people said that, those few brave people that came forward and said that, hang on, shouldn't women have rights as well? We're just as much worth as men. People laughed at them and said that they were crazy. And you can kind of draw similar tendencies now when people say that, hang on, shouldn't we treat nature and other inhabitants with respect? People laugh or kind of ridicule us to say that, but it's not that far off when you start to think about it.
No, exactly, and it's even ridiculous when people have this attitude, but at the same time, we are having all those increased natural disasters, for example, due to climate change, and well, we don't know yet what's going to happen with ocean acidification or microplastic pollution. So it's kind of crazy that people have this attitude, while this might actually really, really negatively affect our not just well-being, but also the economy.
Yeah, for sure. Without the healthy environment, we won't have an economy, which I think is somewhere along the way we've forgotten that all is about nature. It doesn't matter who's the richest or who has what resources or etc. unless we have like this safe world where we live. Yeah.
I'm kind of wishing that somebody would tell all of this to the current political system in place in the US, but you know.
Yeah, me too. Hopefully, maybe in a few years. I think this is a movement which will just grow and grow, and again, just like the women's rights and just like human rights and the rights of all kinds of people, it will come to this time where we actually recognize that nature is so important to us, and we need to shift our mindsets into actually recognizing that legal rights is something that not only we should give to nature, but that's actually something that's already existing. Nature has the right, and we just need to understand that it's time to realize that this is something we need to recognize. It's not just us giving it rights, it's actually something that it has because it's existing.
Yes, exactly.
We've actually we've kind of done this in the past. In the US, we started out with, when we created the federal agencies, we started out with just the Forest Service, which was created by Gifford Pinchot, who had the viewpoint of get as much as you can from the land. And then we had this other really weird guy named John Muir, who basically said that we need to conserve the environment, not just preserve it for future use. And ultimately, that's been what's happened in the US. We're not anywhere near giving environments their own legal rights, but we've at least moved in the right direction. And the fact that there are so many countries that have given environments their own legal rights is definitely heartening.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also, it's so counterintuitive to not factor in the rights of nature and the preservation of it. Not just, for example, when regions don't have access to clean drinking water, But also, if you think about, like you've been talking about the human rights and also just our mental health and well-being. I mean, we have all those studies about how the environment affects our well-being and how do you say, the urban environment can lead to these mental, I wouldn't necessarily say illnesses, but at least it impairs our health. So yeah.
Yeah, and also like just thinking about the global situation and how to create like actual global justice. We should probably think about actually what rights of nature can do concerning the question of justice. Because then it wouldn't be about which country does have the most resources. Again, it would be about actually whether if we move from the question of sovereignty to more universal framework that nature has its own rights, which needs to be respected. It's not about the state's rights to the resources. And that's probably a very possible way to create justice in the world. And like you say, Peter, achieve actually realize human rights and all over the world, and the right to clean water, etc.
Yes, exactly. And like people in a given region at a given time shouldn't have the right to drastically impair the natural resources or nature in a region.
No, I totally agree. Yeah.
And that is connected to the human rights side of it, that just like we are doing on a global scale right now, that we are drastically impairing the rights of future generations to a sound environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess this is like we've been talking about, this is kind of one stop for all rights in a sense, although of course we need to pursue all right movements on a global scale, but this is kind of at the base of all of them.
It should be, yeah. It should be the absolute best way to actually make sure that we do achieve global justice. We do have a way that we both respect human rights and foremost create a safe environment and safe future, where all, not only humans but also all entities and objects and which should be subjects, animals, etc., are respected for what they are, which is a part in a world that is a ecosystem and where everybody has their function and is needed for what they are, not what they might be to someone else.
Yes, exactly. And then we are basically just moving back to forward to what has been integral in indigenous cultures around the world.
Yeah, exactly. The way they live in and respecting their ways of living. So what went wrong with our economy and colonial ways that create this massive wrongdoing to the whole world, basically.
Yeah, and that's the fault of using the GDP as a measure for our success as opposed to using happiness.
Yeah, exactly, like Bhutan.
Yeah, it would be kind of like using the weight of a person to assess the person's health.
Mm. Yeah. So it would really, cool if in the future, like, we as young people that's concerned about the Arctic could actually stand behind something like this as a group and actually promote and say that this is what we believe in because of these reasons. That's the way I think to get heard. Because young people working together, actually promoting something which they absolutely think is the right way. That's how you get people to listen, I think.
Yes, exactly. And to tell a short story of when I visited Alaska last January and got to learn a little bit about the various indigenous cultures in Alaska. And when I learned that they have these pillars in their culture about respect for self, respect for family, respect for environment, and respect for different cultures, it really struck me that, of course, these perspectives are so simple and so important, but it really struck me how my culture just does not really have those things. And it's kind of like waking up, seeing yourself and your own culture really, really underdeveloped. So yeah, it's very important to be able to share this.
For sure, I completely agree. Why it's so important also to include these indigenous youth into this network that we're creating, so we actually can bring their knowledge and their ways of living into what we want to stand for, and to remind us what's important.
Exactly, and that's why we have this such a strong emphasis on having not just a good regional distribution of youth in the network, but especially good cultural distribution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, with that, would you guys mind if we ended this just a few minutes early?
No,
yeah, sure.
I wanted to say thank you for listening and having me.
Anytime, Stina. And thank everybody who's here for joining us today. This has been a presentation from the Global Arctic Youth Network, where we are working to shape the future of the Arctic. Join us for future seminars that will be at this time every Sunday for, I believe, the next 5 Sundays. And at the upcoming Arctic Youth Seminar in October of 2018 in Rovaniemi, Finland, to help us share our vision of the Arctic with the world. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.